Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. There are more than 1 million students in the New York City public school system, which is the largest in the nation. Many of those students are poor, large numbers are homeless, and there are myriad challenges of other kinds. Preparing all of our students for a better life in the wider world is an immense task. We'll take a look at how well we're doing with my guest, Leonie Haimson, the director of Class Size Matters, an advocacy group that has fought for years for smaller classrooms and better access to a quality education for all students. Leonie, welcome. Thanks so much for coming by. I really appreciate it. You know, we've had several years now of corporate-style reform of the public schools. Immense amounts of money have been thrown at this project. What have we reaped from this? How well have we done, or how poorly have we done? Where are we at?
So we've had about a decade or more in New York City in particular, and varying degrees of that around the country, of a very top-down system in which the emphasis has been put on blaming teachers for poor achievement, particularly in schools with large numbers of poor kids, and to the extent possible privatizing the system, outsourcing it either to corporations in the form of charter schools, vouchers, or online learning. And so far, the other part of this is a tremendous emphasis on testing. We have not seen great improvement in the results, and so far it looks like this project is failing. What it doesn't really reach is the conditions in the classroom that allow and encourage kids to learn. And until we really focus on the classroom in a new way, I don't think that these people who are trying to impose a very rigid ideology on our schools are going to succeed.
One of the things I never really understood was why anyone thought that sort of these insane amounts of testing, these standardized tests, how that would be helpful in terms of student achievement, in terms of helping students learn. It's one thing to sort of analyze how much students have learned, but there's been so much testing that it really seems out of control. Can you talk about that a little?
So the theory is that we need more accountability in our schools. We need more results from our teachers, from our schools, and from our students. And without testing them and imposing very, very high standards on them and evaluating them via these test scores, we're not going to get the results that we need. And somehow the theory is that teachers are slacking off, students are slacking off, principals are slacking off, and what the problem is that they're just not trying hard enough. And also that there are too many ineffective teachers in our schools, and if we only measured their effectiveness via student test scores and got rid of them and eliminated job protections, then we could get in a whole new crew of people who would do so much better.
Is there any evidence that any of that is true?
No, there's absolutely no evidence. I mean, the evidence that exists is that, especially in high needs districts with a lot of poor kids, we see a lot more teacher turnover, and that up to 20% of the teaching force leaves every year. And we do know that more experience leads to more effectiveness. So what we believe that in order to make for a more experienced teaching force, what you need to do, again, is improve learning conditions, particularly in high-need school districts, to lure them into staying in the profession longer and lure them into staying in those schools. And instead, because we're blaming all the poor conditions on them, we're doing quite the opposite. We're doing everything to drive our teachers out of these schools.
Well, what's interesting is I've talked to a lot of the so-called reformers, and they actually say that experience is not helpful when it comes to teaching. It's the only profession I've ever heard of where experience is not helpful. But they go, many go so far as to say that, in fact, more experience is a hindrance. And then they point to something, for example, like Teach for America, where these young kids come out of college and agree to teach in the public schools for 2 or 3 years, I suppose, and they say that that's the route we're supposed to take. What is the rationale for that? And we've had Teach for America, but also, I don't want to pick on them, but also other efforts at reforming the teacher profession over the past several years. What have been the results? What have we seen?
I don't think there's any profession in which the actual research is so clear that experience matters as in teaching. You can see it very clearly if you look at test scores, if you look at all sorts of different measures. Experience makes a huge amount of difference, and no parent wants a first or a second year teacher for their child. And in fact, if you go out to the private schools or the well-funded public schools in the suburbs, they just won't they won't hire a first-year teacher because they know they're not going to be able to do as good a job. So it's only in the high-need school districts with the poorest kids who have the highest needs do we see this push to put inexperienced people in who will only stay 1 or 2 years. I honestly think it's to save money. I don't believe that anyone really thinks that these kids are going to do a better job. And once upon a time, it kind of made sense because there was a shortage of teachers, especially in large cities, partially because of the turnover rate. But right now, we're seeing layoffs across the country, layoffs of good, experienced teachers. In the past few years, we've lost over 300,000 teaching positions in this country, and class sizes have been rising. And there's absolutely no need to essentially hire temps for what needs to be one of the most valued and relied upon professions.
Now, you mentioned charter schools, which is another favorite pursuit of the reformers.
Right.
And in fact, I've talked to many parents who sort of swear by charter schools. Many think that they are the be-all and the end-all. The research seems to show that that's not necessarily the case. Tell me what we should be thinking about this enormous push for charter schools.
So the one most rigorous national study that's been done showed that about 18% of charters get better results, about 30% get worse results, and the rest get about the same results. And what I see, having been in New York City for the past 10 or more years, where there's been this tremendous rapid expansion of charter schools and encouragement by this administration, by the people who run the Department of Education, to provide them free space and all sorts of subsidies, is that what's actually happening is that the charter schools enroll fewer of our most at-risk kids. They enroll fewer poor kids, they enroll fewer special education kids, and they enroll far fewer English language learners. And they are getting essentially the easier to educate kids, and they're getting special subsidies, more city money, more private money, smaller classes, and meanwhile in our public schools, we're getting a higher concentration of high needs kids educated in even worse conditions. So it's creating two school systems of vast inequities and worsening whatever inequitable conditions are in our public schools. And I don't see any change in that, because right now we have a new law that was imposed on us from Albany, which in fact said that New York City has to provide free space to all new and expanding charter schools going forward, up to millions and millions of dollars. And meanwhile, our public school students are in extremely overcrowded conditions. And so essentially they say they're appealing to parent choice, but what they're doing is they're forcing parents to choose charter schools because those are the only schools that are going to get new space going forward.
Well, the situation in New York seems particularly perverse, because as you mentioned, there's quite a shortage of classroom space for traditional public schools, and now we do have this law insisting that the city provides space or pay for the schools themselves to find space for charter schools. So just how serious is the overcrowding problem in the traditional schools in New York City?
So we just put out a report called Space Crunch, and what it shows is that elementary schools have gotten significantly more overcrowded in the last 5 years. And the average elementary school in New York City is over 97% utilized. Over 102% utilized is the median. What that means is there are nearly 500,000 students in extremely overcrowded conditions in our public schools. And the Department of Education admits that that number is an underestimate because the formula actually does not take into account all the space the kids need to really learn. So we're seeing increased overcrowding every year. and kids learning in larger and larger classes. They're losing their art room, their science room, their libraries. They have to have lunch as early as 10 a.m. in the morning, and special needs kids are getting their services in hallways and in closets. And it really is undermining the ability, the opportunity of these kids to learn. Right now in New York City, we have the highest class sizes in 15 years in the early grades kindergarten through third grade, which are the most important years to keep class sizes low, and the highest class sizes since 2002 in grades 4 through 8. So this is a huge problem, and it really needs to be tackled. And so far, we don't see the new administration facing it head on, though we do have hope that perhaps they will realize and do a better job.
Now, going back quite a few years,
Yeah.
we had this big fight in New York over mayoral control of
Right.
the public school system. And finally, mayoral control became a fact. The state changed the law. Michael Bloomberg became mayor, and he had control over the public schools. And he had an idea of the kinds of reforms that he wanted to impose, and he imposed many of them.
Right.
Now there is a new mayor, Bill de Blasio, who has a different perspective or a different approach to the public schools. And all of a sudden, the idea of mayoral control of the schools seems less important to the folks in Albany, and they've passed this law that actually undermined mayoral control. Talk about that a little bit.
Right. So after 12 years of Michael Bloomberg, who did everything he could to show preferential treatment to the charter schools by giving them free space and essentially allowing them giving them more city money per student than public schools, we elected a mayor after 12 years who quite openly ran on a platform of saying he was not going to favor charter schools anymore, and he was going to make them pay rent. And Bill de Blasio was overwhelmingly elected on that basis. And one of the reasons he said that is not that he had a personal grudge against charters, but that he went throughout the city, met with parents, appeared at forums, and he realized that this was one of the most contentious issues for parents across the city. That they saw their kids getting squeezed out by charter schools. And yet, when he finally was elected and said that this is what he was going to do, charge charters rent or make them find their own space, the charter lobby and the hedge funders put up a actually turned out to be a $6 million ad campaign bashing him. And trying to drive his popularity down. And then the Governor Cuomo, who gets huge money from some of the same supporters of the charter schools, in his contributions, pushed through a law which basically took the allocation of space out of the mayor's hands for the first time. And it really showed that it wasn't a matter of principal mayoral control, it was that they would support a mayor who had the same ideological baggage that they did and was pushing for privatization. And when we had a mayor that was elected that was no longer for privatization, they would take that power out of his hands.
When you look at the youngsters, not just in New York City, but across the country, who are not doing well in school, inevitably you will find that they are the poorer children.
Absolutely.
Poverty is a big issue. And yet the corporate-style reformers will frequently insist that poverty is not the issue, that those who claim that it is are trying to use poverty as an excuse, that any child can learn as long as you follow their prescription, which is more testing, more charter schools, and that sort of thing.
Right.
But that's just flat not true, right? I mean, poverty is an enormous issue, and all you have to do is walk around the schools, talk to the children and their families, walk into the neighborhoods, talk a little bit about the impact of poverty on the ability of children to do well in school.
A child's economic background is the greatest determinant by far on their achievement level in school, and it's totally understandable given the challenges these families are dealing with, whether it's health or coming to school hungry or homeless or whatever, or simply not having enough books at home to really give that child the sort of background that they need, or helping your child with his homework or whatever. And so it is clear that in order to really equalize opportunity, we have to talk about opportunities in the home as well as the school, and we have to do something about the widening income gap, because no educational system, no matter how good, is going to be able to close that gap entirely. However, it's also true that educational policies are very, very important, and there are a few reforms that have been proven to work to narrow the achievement gap, and class size reduction is one of them. And yet the same reformers who say they care about improving opportunities for poor kids have been absolutely opposed to reducing class size. From Bill Gates to Michelle Rhee, they've come out on record saying they think it's a waste of money, even though in many cases they send their own kids to private schools where class sizes are very small. And the OECD recently came out with a study saying there are only 3 developed countries in the world in which poor kids have larger class sizes than rich kids, and the United States, Israel, and Turkey are those 3 countries. So I think in order to give a fair shot to our kids, we have to do something about poverty, but we also have to make sure that there are truly equitable conditions in our schools, and that if anything, poor kids need even smaller classes and more support at school and more attention from their teachers than middle class and wealthy children.
One of the ironies related to No Child Left Behind was that the whole idea supposedly was that it was going to help the children who were having the most difficult time in school, when in fact those are the children who are being left behind. Now, No Child Left Behind was followed by the Obama administration's Race to the Top program. Compare the two and tell us whether we're moving in the right direction or, well, what's happening.
So I call Race to the Top No Child Left Behind on steroids, because what it basically did is if you don't adopt these particular policies, including increasing the number of charter schools, imposing high-stakes accountability system, judging teachers on the basis of test scores, which is completely statistically unreliable and unfair, we're not going to give you this money, these federal grant programs. And they did this at a time when school districts around the country and states were starving for funds because of the Great Recession. And it also put into effect of these programs where basically they said for schools that are struggling, you have a narrow set of choices. You either have to close them completely, fire half the teachers, or turn them over to private corporations. And that has been devastating across the country and devastating in New York City, because these kids are having their lives ripped apart by their schools being closed and being transferred from one school to another. I think Mayor Bloomberg closed over 100 schools, and in those schools you can see rising dropout rates, rising discharge rates. This is not the way to improve an educational system. What you need to do is go into those schools and give those teachers and those kids more support. You do not close them down.
One of the big issues on the scene now is Common Core. Explain what Common Core is, and then talk a little bit about how this has been implemented.
So, you know, there's a great debate even in the research establishment about how much standards matter. And there are some people who've done studies showing that some states with very good standards do not necessarily do well in terms of outcomes, and others say that, well, it's important to have good standards. But the fact is that the way the Common Core standards were developed, mostly in secret, mostly by testing companies. There were, in the original committee that developed them, there was not one classroom teacher, there was not one special education teacher or expert in early childhood development. And it was done in a very rushed and secretive manner. And there are a lot of severe flaws with the outcome, with the standards themselves. Beyond that, they've been allied with these very, very difficult, and some people see them as abusive testing. So what happened in New York State, where we're sort of ahead of the curve in terms of the timeline on the Common Core, we've had these tests where literally they've flunked 2/3 of all the kids in the state, including in some of the better school districts in Long Island and Westchester, where families pay a lot of property taxes and they have good schools, and over 90% of their kids go on to four-year colleges and do well. And they gave them these tests and they said, your kids are not college and career ready. And the parents are fighting mad. They're fighting mad in Long Island, they're fighting mad in the rest of the state, and they say, we do not believe you, we think these tests are unfair, we think they're not actually testing what our kids need to know. If you look at the tests themselves, they were full of errors, just like the pineapple question on the Pearson test. They They're full of product placements, which makes people very uncomfortable, like literally, you know, Legos and all sorts of toys with the copyright and the trademark put in. And they were very, very long. I think for third graders, there were many, many hours. And so people do not want their kids tested to death. They do not think the Common Core is necessarily appropriate at all, especially for young children. And there's a real pushback across the state and I think increasingly across the nation because they feel like these were imposed by the federal government. And it's true that there's a law that says the federal government is not supposed to get involved in curriculum decisions, and yet again, this was one of the conditions for getting these Race to the Top grants.
If we had an opportunity to start over and establish programs that really would reach all of the children in our public schools, what are some of the most important steps that we would need to be taking right now?
Well, you know, my thing is class size, and I think it's only one of a handful of reforms, actually, according to the Institute of Education Sciences, which have been proven to work by rigorous evidence to improve outcomes for all kids, but especially poor and minority kids.
We need smaller classes.
We need smaller classes. We need to support our teachers to make sure that they don't quit at the high numbers they do. So teacher attrition across the board is very high. I think 50% of teachers leave after 5 years, and rates are even higher in our inner cities. And I don't think of any profession, whether the legal profession or the medical profession, where we would allow those kinds of attrition rates. So we need to talk to our teachers and say, what do you need to succeed? If you look at a country like Finland, they actually give tremendous respect and autonomy to their teachers. At the same time, they've reduced class sizes across the board. It is a highly respected profession. There is no testing at all, no standardized testing in Finland until you get to the college admissions level.
And yet I keep hearing that Finland is the society that we should be looking at because they've been so successful with public education, and yet no testing at all.
No testing at all until you get to like 16 or 17 when you decide whether you're going to college or vocational school. No testing at all. They have recess. Every hour they have a 15-minute recess. They have very short school days. They have almost no homework. But what they do have is highly equitable funding across the board. No child is labeled special education. Each child gets the individual attention they need, whatever that may be. And it's a very humane system. And it seems to work really, really well. Now, Finland also has low poverty rates, as we know, so that the outcomes are going to automatically be better. But there are other countries such as Sweden and Norway which also have low poverty rates, and yet they do not have the same outcomes in education that Finland would have. So we think that that is a system to emulate. Smaller classes, equitable funding, more support and respect for teachers. We also really need to get back to a well-rounded education. Right now we're focusing all our efforts on raising test scores, especially in English and math. Our kids are losing art, music, and science. They're losing the things that engage their imaginations, project-based learning, all those things, and are instead being fed a steady diet of test prep, and that is just absolutely the wrong way to go.
Well, this has been wonderful. I wish we had more time to talk. Leonie, thank you so much for coming by.
Well,
I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. From South Carolina comes a story of a mother who was arrested and charged with a felony for letting her 9-year-old daughter play in a local park while the mother was working at a McDonald's. This happened in the town of North Augusta. The mother couldn't afford a nanny, so the child usually spent her time in the restaurant amusing herself with a laptop. But when the laptop was stolen in a burglary, she asked if she could play in the park instead. The mother said yes and gave the child a cell phone to keep with her. A parent who saw the unaccompanied child in the park called the police. Incredibly, the child was characterized as abandoned, and the mother was arrested and thrown in jail. The Department of Social Services took custody of the girl. What this is crazy. Another way of tormenting poor people, criminalizing them. When I was a kid, my parents could have been arrested every day because I was always in the park. When I was 8 and 9 years old, I rode my bike all over Montclair, New Jersey, unaccompanied. No one would ever have imagined that my parents could have been jailed and our family ripped apart. We need to get a grip. That's all for now. See you next time.